Were you concentrating on what you were doing, or were you mind wandering? And then other question about your happiness level. And what they found is that whenever people were focused on what they were doing, they were more happy than when they were mind wandering. You're happier when you're in the now. You're engaged in what you're doing. When you're projecting in the present or in the past, there might be some underlying, I'm not happy in the present right now. That's why I'm gonna revisit the past or the future in my thoughts.
Arnaud Delorme is a scientist who has spent the past 20 years trying to understand, why do our minds wander? In this conversation, we explore the science of mind wandering and what he's learned that can help you live a happier and healthier life. We also talk about the nature of consciousness and the big questions the scientific community is trying to answer that may just shift the human experience. Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Hey Arnaud, how you doing today?
Good, how are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk about mind wandering and many other interesting paths that we can go down. And maybe just to frame the conversation, how would you define mind wandering?
So mind wandering for people who are not meditators, like if you're meditating, you know what mind wandering is, because you're probably spending a lot of time mind wandering during your meditation, where you're trying to focus on your breath, but your mind doesn't want to stay on your breath. You're thinking of all these other things. But if you're not meditating, the best way to define it is when you're reading a book and then, 2 pages down, you realize, oh, I wasn't even reading. I was thinking of something else, but, you were continuing to read. So that is, kind of the archetypical definition of mind wandering. You just drift off and go into your own thoughts.
How did this become something that you were interested in exploring?
About 20 years ago, I started to meditate and my mind was wandering everywhere. And so I'm a neuroscientist. And so it wasn't studied at all in neuroscience in these days. So I thought, well, I'm interested in meditation and, that would be great if I can redirect my work to study that. So that's what I did.
And I guess the question that I think a lot of us have, including myself, is why does this happen? I mean, why is it that when we sit down in meditation or read a book, all of a sudden we find ourselves thinking about what's for lunch or what we need to do or any of these other things that can kind of slowly work their way into our awareness?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question. We don't actually know what it happens. I mean, we have some cues. For example, if you were fully concentrated, you're watching a movie that doesn't end and you're fully into the movie, and your mind never drift off into, oh, I'm hungry, oh, I need to do this, etc. You might just die just because your mind is just locked on to something. So maybe it's a regulation mechanism that allows us to prioritize basically the thoughts and feelings and hunger and bodily sensations. And then there's other hypothesis. It's a kind of micro sleep. You can go into, so your brain goes into micro sleep just to rest a little bit. And there are other hypotheses saying, well, this is good for creativity. Thoughts pop up in your brain when you're mind wandering and you can use them creatively. So yeah, there's lots of possibility why our brain, our mind wanders.
Well, maybe we can start about what we have learned in your research. And so I guess maybe to go there is, what have been the big findings that you've discovered about mind wandering and why we should care about it?
I think one of the big findings, at least in the research community, is that you can study these phenomena. So you can just ask people, whether they're mind wandering or not, you put them in the lab and you ask them every 10 minutes, are you mind wandering? And so you can study them in that way. So even though, it's been something that's ubiquitous, like when you're reading a book, I think science believed before you can't study these. It's just too fleeting, it's too abstract. It can't be studied by science. So I think that's one big revelation is these are phenomena, brain and mind phenomena that can be studied scientifically. And then if we can study them scientifically, we can find regularities. How do these thoughts, come up? Why do they come up? What happens when you drink alcohol? How does that change things? Or when you're depressed, how does that change your mind wandering? So, I think one of the big revelation is that these phenomena, which were described, thousands of years in the Eastern traditions by meditators, can be studied scientifically.
One distinction I've seen you make is the difference between spontaneous mind wandering and intentional mind wandering. And I'm curious for you to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a very fine distinction. So when you talk about mind wandering, and if it's in this standard language, people would probably say daydreaming. Mind wandering is a scientific term, and different researcher will mean different thing about mind wandering. So it depends how you define it. But I like the example of, washing the dishes. For example, you're washing the dishes. So you mind wander usually once you do something relatively boring. So you're washing the dishes and you're starting to think, oh, I need to go to the supermarket to get some groceries. Is it like a spontaneous thoughts? Is your mind drifting from washing the dishes? Or is it a voluntary thoughts? I need to go get groceries. It's like, it's a fine line. On one hand, you're washing dishes, there is food on the dishes, so your mind automatically make an association with, getting groceries and just automatically drift into these thoughts. Or on the other hand, you think you will the thought, oh, I wanted to have that thought at that moment. So involuntary versus voluntary thought is not something that's clear cut. Have these thoughts that's completely involuntary and these thoughts that's completely voluntary, which is why it's also super interesting to study mind wandering, is that because it's just the process of thinking. You could consider all our thoughts are mind wandering to some extent, and then we just think, we will them. We might not.
Do you notice any? I think there was some research done on happiness levels or well-being levels related to just the presence of this kind of mind-wandering experiences or not. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there was a very influential paper that was published in Nature, which is one of the top ranking journal in science, that showed that, and I did the experience myself, that when you're mind wandering, you're less happy. And so the way it works is, I remember when I was doing the experiment, it's on your smartphone. So these are Harvard professors, and you could sign up online. Anybody could sign up. So I signed up and I received messages like twice a day. What are you doing right now? Were you concentrated on what you were doing, or were you mind wandering? And then other question about your happiness level. And what they found is that whenever people were focused on what they were doing, they were more happy than when they were mind wandering, whatever they were doing. So, and they also had, for example, in this questionnaire, some people, you can see that on the paper, said, oh, I was engaging in sexual intercourse. And some people were mind wandering during that, were less happy when they were not mind wandering. But it could be washing dishes. I remember, answering the questionnaire when I was on my bike. I was riding my bike to work. And so I would stop, answer the question and then resume my ride anytime during the day, any activity.
Just from your own I know you have a meditation background. Do you hypothesize that that's because people are happier when they're more present, or because the general thoughts of the content of the thoughts when uncontrolled are often uncomfortable for many people?
I do think it has to be, you're happier when you're in the now, you're engaged in what you're doing. When you're projecting in the present or in the past, there might be some, underlying, I'm not happy in the present right now. That's why I'm going to revisit the past or the future in my thoughts. So I think there is something of that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. I know there's also been a lot of people that talk about the benefit of imagination and letting the mind roam free versus just kind of focus maniacally on the next task and the next task. And lots of times that can be a quite expansive experience. How would things like imagination and this idea of mind wandering come together? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and so there's been experiments on that. So on one hand, there's lots of researchers who say, well, mind wandering makes you unhappy. There's also experiments that show that mind wandering makes you more creative. And the way researchers study that is that, I would show you a brick on the screen, and you would come up with as many possible use for that brick, paperweight, building a house, and you become more creative if I gave you some time to mind wander. Basically, I show you the brick, and either I give you 2 minutes to do nothing, or I give you 2 minutes of something that's going to engage your attention. When I give you 2 minutes of doing nothing, where you're free to mind wander, you're going to be more creative. You're going to come up with more use of that object, more creative use of that object, basically. So, mind wandering might assist creativity.
So there seems to be this interesting dichotomy of mind wandering can hinder happiness, but it also can aid productivity or creativity rather. And so how should we think about that as, creatives, as entrepreneurs, as people that are trying to, birth our creations into the world?
Yeah, I feel, there's both sides of the coins. I mean, sometimes you have to concentrate and you don't want to be distracted by thoughts. And a lot of in the books, we have some technique to remain more concentrated. And sometimes, you want to let your mind roam free and, get some new ideas. So I think you need to, be able to leverage both. And the type of mind wandering that makes us creative is not usually the problem. The kind of mind wandering that's hindering our happiness is the one where we have, repetitive thoughts, about something negative or, these kind of things.
I know that you have done a lot of research on an exploration on the nature of consciousness. Is it something that's entirely locally created? Are there potential information outside of our experience, perhaps, that are influencing what we experience as thoughts? Where are you at with your current research on that body of interest?
Yeah, so that's so I was always interested in Eastern religion, and in Eastern religion you have the siddhis, the special powers of the yogis, telepathy. And so I try to address these questions using the scientific method, because the scientific method doesn't care, if it's immoral or not, doesn't care if people say it's possible or not. You can just apply it to all of these questions. Like, for example, let's take telepathy. You can just put, two twins in different rooms, and one time of experiments I like is to, like twins, they say, one breaks a arm, the other ones can feel it on the other side of the world. Is this real? You can test that in laboratory, where you ask a twin to put their hand in the ice cold bucket and keep it there. And, it generates some pains that maybe the other twin can feel. So we can apply the scientific method to all of these experiments. I would say there is some, documented results that are conducive to, from my perspective, pursuing this line of research, in the sense that, it is of interest. One study doesn't show anything. Once there's just one body of evidence, needs to be reproduced by other laboratories. But I do think it's a topic, that's worth investigating.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness, the Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. Has there been any evidence that points to, so I guess my question is what have you found that makes it worthwhile to study further? And I guess specifically telepathy.
Telepathy. Well, the kind of study I did was I studied specifically what's called mediumship, where you go to someone that's going to tell you about your deceased relative. And I wasn't interested necessarily whether they were communicating with spirit, more if they could get some kind of information they were not supposed to have access to. And the first thing when you go to see someone like that, they're trying to convince you they're in contact with that person. So we have a lot of evidence. They're trying to give you lots of evidence that we can double check. So I did several experiments with these in double blind settings, trying to see, do they get any cues? And it could be from telepathy. It could be like from just reading their subjects, reading the patients that's right here. Except in our case, they didn't see the patient. We just gave them a name. And the person that gave them the name didn't even know who this person was. That's what it was, double blinded. And can they access that information? And we found that we got, in some cases, significant results, what we call significant results. And in science, you never demonstrate things for sure. It's only beyond reasonable doubt. So in that case, in this experiment was, demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt, but it needs to be reproduced by other laboratories. And in the end, it might prove to, be a real phenomena. And I believe, science is about data. So let's just look at the data, see what the data says.
So it sounds like you guys found some evidence, but we need a lot more studies to basically make this something that we can say this exists. This is a fact. This is a real human potentiality that some people seem to have access to versus others.
We need studies and also models. Because we don't have a model right now, how is it fit with our model of the world? We have like the four fundamental forces, the three molecular forces and gravity. So where would that fit? From my perspective, consciousness could be seen as another force of nature. Mostly believe it's very hard to imagine how it could be reduced to, these other fundamental forces. I like to give, I was talking to philosopher Steven Pinker last month. We were both invited in Harvard to give a seminar. And I told him, this thought experiment. Imagine you have a super fast camera. You can look at the brain, at the picosecond level. You can see every chemical reaction. And, with this very fast camera, you take a picture of the brain of someone was thinking, was conscious, and you slow down the movie down to you see, every molecule moving. Where's subjectivity? Where is consciousness there? And from my perspective, you need something else. You need something else than the three dead, or four dead fundamental forces of physics to explain consciousness.
Well, I think you have an interesting, I'm going to pop this image up on the screen. You kind of have this interesting model of consciousness where you have, are you just your brain? Yes, no, it's kind of almost a decision tree. And then you have, is consciousness epiphenomena, which I actually don't know what that word means. Could you describe
that? So
an
epiphenomenon is where most neuroscientists would stand these days. They say, oh yeah, consciousness exists, but it just arises because of the complexity of neural network interacting, and it just arises magically. consciousness arises magically from this neural network interaction. And that's why I like my thought experiments, where you have a super fast camera and you slow down everything and you see where does it arises exactly. I don't see it arising myself. And so if it's an epiphenomena, then you have, arises, it's just you have the absence of free will, because yes, you have the feeling of being conscious, but it's just your neural network, it's just a byproduct of your neural network. So consciousness doesn't have basically a causal influence on matter. It's just something that emerges and that cannot necessarily influence matter. If it was influencing matters, it would be neural networks anyway. So it will still be, something physical. Or is there something that's more like immaterial to consciousness, in which that's the hypothesis, we are more than our brain. So that's the top one. And if we are more than our brain, and that's one of the next slide in this presentation, but there's two arrows. One is we are more than our brain, but consciousness is still in the brain. So, it's local. It's like an energy field that's local to your brain, or that's an energy field that can have influence outside the brain. So, even there is different possibility. And so when it can have influence outside the brain, you could say, maybe that's support telepathy. But there's also very interesting experiments which are mainstream in science that shows that we react to solar flares. Our body reacts to solar flares. Women menstrual cycle react to the phase of the moon. So we are all the time influenced by our environment in ways we don't suspect. And you can imagine, a way telepathy could, this is the one where, the human brain is sensitive to the magnetic field. We thought only pigeon, were sensitive to magnetic field and could use it as, the Earth magnetic field as a GPS to orient themselves. But researchers found that when you create artificial magnetic fields, you can also see difference in the human brain physiology. So we have what we call magnetoreceptor inside our brain that detects the magnetic field. And people didn't think that was possible before. But, that could be one support for telepathy, for example, where, it's like if there's a strong surge in the Earth magnetic field, every single human feel on Earth. And then we are like, that's kind of a telepathic event where, we're all connected at some point.
Yeah. So I guess just to kind of summarize, so I understand. So, there is research documenting that there are certain things in the magnetic field that we are aware of that move beyond our kind of like classic senses of sight, hearing, that are impacting us. And so presumably the fact that we are impacted by these forces points to, some kind of field that we're all experiencing and maybe just have not really recognized, which could also be the transference of information like thoughts in the case of telepathy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, my working hypothesis, and, again, I'm a scientist. I believe in data. So, it's an hypothesis that can be falsified. It's an hypothesis that might be true or not true, is that consciousness could be like a field, like the electromagnetic field in physics. It's not a field of physics that's basically electromagnetic field is infinite. If you have a small battery, in theory, the electromagnetic field extends to the other side of the universe. Very, very low amplitude, but it affects the entire field. So in the same way, consciousness could be, everywhere, entire field, and for some reason, our brain just has the mechanism to concentrate that field, like, plasma accelerator, and consciousness is concentrated inside the brain. So I like that image. And of course, it's just a scientific hypothesis. And, we don't,
Have you had any direct experiences in your meditation or, I don't know if you've done other type of kind of mind altering experiences that currently fall outside the bounds of what we can prove with science?
I've had synchronicities like, trying to just playing the telepathy game, for example, with my girlfriend, and realizing, oh, we can guess, the same. It was ordering stone with symbols, and, could guess the same sequence of 7 stone. And the likelihood of that is 1 in 10 million. And it's not a scientific experiment, but, as a scientist, I look at the probability of doing that is just so low. So I've had some of that. I haven't had I had some out of body experience, but they're not as transforming as, some other people claim. So yeah, that's the extent. I don't think I'm necessarily super receptive to this kind of experience, because, like, scientists are rational. So, they reason everything, the reason for everything. And sometimes you're not receptive to, the more creative experiences. But I heard stories from people who are very close to me, which are compelling.
That's interesting. I know one study that you did was that I've always been intrigued about, or you alluded to, is how different types of meditation show up on EEGs. So, there's all these different kind of schools of ways of kind of working with the mind and meditation. And I've always been curious, are they equal? Are some better than others? How does that show up in our brain? What can we actually prove with data? I would love to learn more about that.
That's interesting, because that comes back to mind wandering. I always felt, so I've been teaching in India, and then also I did a lot of experiment in India. And with a colleague of mine, there was an ashram that bought, a brainwave system, very expensive one, about 50K, and we didn't know what to do with it. So they invited us to, record data. And so we recorded data on 4 different traditions of meditation, with the goal to show that all of them, are kind of similar. So they were mantra-based. There was a Zen meditation. There was a Vipassana meditation where you do body scan. And then, of course, there are non-meditators. And we did show that their brain, in many ways, responded very similarly. So they were different from control, especially in the gamma frequency band. We showed that all the meditations tend to share something. And I think that's also aligned with my personal experience. When I was in India, I went to see some of the local gurus, and do some of the Hindu ceremonies. And I remember the guru asked me afterwards, how did it feel to do that ceremony? And I said, yeah, it felt very much like my meditation. The mind, because meditation for me is like you study your mind. You study mind wandering. You study your mind getting attached to this idea, and then letting go, and then grabbing this other idea, etc. And so that's what I told him. I told him during the ceremony, sometimes I was concentrated, but sometimes my mind was drifting, and I was just looking at my mind drifting and studying my mind. So it was very close to my practice. And I don't know if he agreed or not. He smiled, which maybe he agreed, maybe he did not. But yeah, so that's why we did these experiments in India, where we compared the different meditation and show they were sharing very similar characteristics in terms of brainwave production, although there were also some differences that we noted.
Yeah, I think the question probably a lot of people have, which is, what's the most effective one? What is the one that's going to get my mind into these perhaps places of ease or stillness most rapidly? And I don't know were you able to discern any of that type of information about the efficacy?
So the response to that I have is, like the different traditions are like different path up a mountain. The goal is the same, in all cases. And then your preference, from my perspective, you should use the technique you're going to stick to, because that's the problem with meditation. Is like you're going to start this technique and then you're going to let it go. So use the one that you can stick to, and that will be the one for you.
I think that's wise advice. Do what you will actually do. So, what there's kind of some outstanding questions here, both in mind wandering and the nature of consciousness. What are the big questions right now that you and the scientific field is looking at that may or may not point to a new story for our inner experience?
So the main question we're looking at is consciousness bound by the brain or not? Is consciousness a product of the brain or not? Purely a product of the brain. Obviously, a lot of our conscious experience originates from the brain, but is it 100%? And so my hypothesis is no, but other hypothesis is yes. So I think that's the main question. And along with this question is that is it an even question that can be answered? So we published a paper showing that it might be able we might be able to answer that question. Telepathy is one that would answer it right away. It's like, if telepathy is real, there's no way your consciousness is entirely bound by your brain. Your consciousness is more than your brain, and it's supported. Then we have to find a model and integrate it into physics that explain this phenomena, because it's not magical either. It needs to fit into a model that we don't know yet. So I think that's, and then based on that, I think we need more models of consciousness, and there are several. There's Donald Hoffman model of conscious agents, and from his conscious agents, which are probabilistic agents, you can derive all the laws of quantum mechanics, etc. So there are people, trying to build the theory, but there's nothing that's accepted widely yet.
It's a very interesting time for all of this. And the one question that I have, a question that comes up for me is, my hypothesis mirrors yours, by the way, that our consciousness is not limited to our brain. Is when and if that becomes an accepted truth, how does the human experience change?
I think, so there's the personal experience, and there is the global experience. I'm interested in both. A lot of science I do is because as a scientist, I believe in data. So once I see the data, it will change me. I'll become less mean to my neighbor because I feel, we're sharing the same consciousness. I just have the illusion that it's mine, and he has the illusion that it's ours. But, true, it's like it has been demonstrated that, we are one to some extent. So then people, become closer to each other and live in more harmony. And at the personal level, people are also happier. And maybe the human civilization doesn't destroy itself in the next 1,000 years.
I think that would be a beautiful thing. I hope you guys, find that data ASAP. Well, Arnaud, this has been a very fun conversation. I know that your book is recently out, and I know people are also interested in staying on top of lots of the experiments and work that you're bringing into the world. Where is the best place that they could find information on that?
So they can find information on my website, arnauddelorme.com. And then also a lot of the more out there experiments I do is with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So also on the website of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, there's a tab for paper and research. And all the papers we publish are in mainstream journals, meaning scientific peer-reviewed journals. But, there's a summary for the lay person so they can understand also what it means.
Awesome. Well, I will link those out. So just go to the show notes and you should have all those links. And thank you, Arnaud. We're very appreciative of the work that you do and for spending time with us today. And also thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much for having me.